waiting in the wings. Mr. and Mrs. Puddle Duck were expecting their first clutch of eggs. It was time to make a nest. But all the good spots by the water's edge were already taken. "What shall we do?" asked Mrs. P. "We don't have much time." "We'll find our own special place," Mr. P replied. They waddled and toddled up the wharf and into town and came to the library. "It's certainly peaceful," Mrs. P quacked. "And our babies would learn a lot," Mr. P clacked. "Quiet, please," the librarian whispered. "People are studying here." The Puddle Ducks quickly flapped away. "Ducklings can't be quiet," said Mrs. P. They pottered and patted and came to the fire station. "It's bright and cheery," said Mr. P. "And clean and shiny," Mrs. P nodded. The siren blared. "Wah!" But too loud for ducklings, Mrs. P shrieked as they scuttled away. They searched all over town, but couldn't find the perfect place to build their nest. "I'm tired," Mrs. P yawned. "I need to take a nap." She hopped into a flower box and nestled in between the daffodils and tulips. Mrs. P looked up at a poster on the building in front of them. "Feathers," he remarked. "That's a good sign." "Let's hope so," said Mrs. P, settling in comfortably, "because our eggs are on their way." One day, a coat rack draped with feathers rattled past the flower box and into the building. "Wow!" Mr. P quacked. "What goes on in there?" "Nothing as important as what's going on here," Mrs. P replied, fluffing her wings around her growing number of eggs. A few days later, a loud buzzing and banging shook the flower box. "What now?" Mr. P squawked. "No need to ruffle your feathers, dear," Mrs. P replied, settling lower into the nest. "Our eggs are nicely soundproofed." Soon, an altogether different sound filled the air, a pleasant, melodious one coming from inside the building. "Oh my!" murmured Mr. P. "That's sweeter than any bird song. What could it be?" "Why don't you go find out?" Mrs. P suggested. Mr. P waddled cautiously through the open doors, then tiptoed down a dark passageway. Rounding a corner, he stopped in his tracks. An enormous room stretched before him. Inside, a group of people were blowing, tapping, and plucking curious objects, making delightful music. Mr. P quickly ducked out of sight and listened in wonder.